Alright, so get to put this up on the articulator. And we'll start on our cones. Let's sharpen this up a little bit. Okay. So we'll use our white wax here. Get a little more heat on the subject. Okay. What you can do is you can drop a little bit of wax on here first, and then add your cone. Now we will close it and see how our wax is lined up. Alright, so it's a little bit too lingual, so we're going to move it out slightly. And as you notice, this particular model has a lot of space, so our cones are going to be higher. On yours it may be a little bit, the cones might be half as high. On this particular model I cut away a little too much of the tooth, so we ended up with a lot of space. Doesn't really matter for the for this exercise. It's just a little bit more work because you gotta fill up all of this space. So what I'm doing right now is I'm going to strengthen that cone a little bit. So that it doesn't break so easily. Then as we can see here, I put it a little bit too close to the edge, so we're going to take away a little bit of that wax, because this area is going to be filled up by blue wax for the tooth contours. So let's bring this in about a ½ millimeter or so. And then we're going to straighten it out a little bit and bring this cusp tip more or less straight up. And as you notice, I'm kind of blowing on it, so you can tease the wax up a little bit higher. So if you have a model like this that has a lot of space, you should do that, because it's much easier to get that wax up high there. And then kind of thicken it up at the bottom here, like so. This will allow us for a little bit less fragility on these cones. So let's put it back on the model and see our overlap, which is pretty good right now. So let's continue. The second cusp tip. Incidentally, this is our cusp to fossa model. So if the cusp is a little too long, we can always remove a little bit of it. Strengthen it a little bit all the way around on the very bottom there. That's where it's going to break off from, so you may want to heat up the wax a little bit and kind of adhere it well to the model itself. And take away a little bit from the buccal surface, so we have room for later. Let's add a little bit more light on the subject here. Let's see. Okay, so lay down a little bit more wax on here. And this will allow us to attach the wax a little bit easier. So we can do little dots everywhere. This might make things go a little faster. You can take this off for now, and let's see. Just add our buccal cusp tips. These cusp tips are a little bit more arbitrary because they don't really contact anything. So as long as you put it up to the center of the lobes, you should be in pretty good shape. Just don't build them too lingual, because then it will crash into the buccal cusps of the mandibular. So you should be building them more or less straight up. So now just take a look at this third molar here. On yours it might be the second molar. So remember, the curve of P runs from a curve from the anterior teeth to the posterior. So the first premolar should be about the size of the canine. The second premolar could be a tiny bit lower, and then the mesial cusp of the molar should be about the same size as the premolar, the second premolar, and then the second cusp on the distal should be a tiny bit shorter, and then the mesial cusp of the second molar should be about the same size as the distal cusp of the first molar. And then the distal cusp of the second molar should be about the same length as the mesial cusp of the third molar. This will give you a nice transition with a slight curve from the anterior to the posterior. So as we can see, we have these cusp tips a little bit offset from the outside, and now we're going to try it back on the articulator. And as we can see, we have an overjet and a little bit of an overbite. Okay, overjet and overbite. So this will allow us to give us a nice triangular ridge when we get to that part. So the next thing we're going to do is the lingual cusps. Now we have to understand where the lingual cusps go. So on the cusp to fossa model, the lingual cusps will go right in the distal fossas of the mandibular premolars. The mesiobuccal cusp here will go into the central fossa of the first molar. So first molar, first molar. The distal cusp will probably go into the distal fossa. So the mesiolingual cusp will go into the central fossa of the mandibular molar, right here. The distal cusp, distal lingual cusp, will go to the distal fossa or distal marginal ridge. Okay, right here somewhere. On the second molar, mesiolingual cusp. On the second molar, mesiolingual cusp will go into the central fossa of the second molar, right there. And the distal lingual cusp will go somewhere in this area here on the distal fossa of the second molar, right there. Okay. Sometimes that second molar can be arbitrary, because if you make this cusp tip here, it might go like right in between this embrasure, which means you'll never achieve contact. And it could be the same here, Could be the same here on the first molar. It might end up in the interproximal area, in the area of the occlusal embrasure, where it might not contact. Okay, so we will start with the premolars. Again, I'm just going to add a little bit of wax on each of these dots so that we won't have too much of an issue. Attaching the cones. So now we'll start building. So you start with a little cone, and then we're going to check with the bite. So we have to take a look, see where it is pointing to. So right now it's pointing in the right general direction. So let's make it taller. Let's check the second one. Okay. That's going pretty much in the right general direction as well. Remember, do not make them touch. Just be about a millimeter or so, half a millimeter or so away from the opposing tooth. Let's go to the molar. Remember, ideally, the lingual cusps of the maxillary teeth are a little bit taller than the buccal, or at least at the same height. Not to say that they're never shorter, but sometimes they could be shorter depending on the physiology of the patient. But on an ideal basis, they are a little bit taller. So let's double check the cusp tips. Alright, they're going generally in the correct direction, so they're just a bit short. Okay, so you see how it kind of goes into the fossa, but it's still not touching the opposing tooth. So let's strengthen the bases of these so that they don't break off too easily. Now on the contralateral side, we're going to do this exact same thing, except that that will be our cusped marginal ridge side. So in that case, we're going to make the cusp tips of the premolars go right to the marginal ridge, or both marginal ridges of the mandibular first premolars. See, if you notice this this cusp here, it's pretty tall, so we have to go a little bit even higher than that when we start waxing the cusp ridges, so that we can achieve that ideal occlusal plane. Remember, the lingual cusps allow us to make the curve of Wilson. And as we know, the curve of Wilson is a curve that occurs laterally, going from left to right on a horizontal plane. The curve of Spee occurs on the sagittal plane. In other words, left and right. The horizontal plane is on top and the bottom. Remember the first lecture that we had when we first started the class. Okay, let's check. That cusp is a little bit too lingual, so let's move it a tiny bit more towards the buckle. Maybe a little bit more. Let's see here. It's kind of going a little too lingually. So let's heat this up a little bit. We could probably move this cusp a little bit more distal too. So let's add a little bit here. And then let's take the instrument and see if we can push it a little bit like so. And then fuse it back together. Oops, melted it. But at least now we know where we want to put it. So let's take a little bit of it off. And then put a little bit more wax and kind of tilt it a little bit more towards the buckle. Just like that. Let's close it. I'm still not happy with that. Although it's not a major cusp, it probably is not. Sometimes they don't even go into occlusion. A little bit more even. All right. See that? Probably bring in the mesiolingual cusp a little bit as well. I'm just going to heat it up a little bit. That way we can push it in slightly. Let's add a little bit to the opposite side to make it a bit stronger. Okay, so that is our cusp to fossa side. Okay. Let's double check. We're gonna put the pin in now. The incisal pin. This is just gonna help us check the eccentric movements. So we're gonna go first to the balancing side. Check the balancing side. Make sure that during our excursion nothing gets knocked off. And it doesn't. Generally what you're looking for is for these cusp tips to be moving right between these two cusps right here. And we're pretty much there. Could be a little bit more distal, but we can correct that later if we need to. This area here I came a little bit too far out, so we're gonna end up taking this cusp in a little bit. So let's do that now. Put it a little bit more lingual as well. That's where we're gonna need it to be. And why? Because when we go into an excursion, we want this cusp to be traveling straight between those grooves right there. You see? When we go to the balancing side, when we make these cusps, they will be traveling right in between those two cusps on the mandibular molar. And that's what we want to really do with the second molar as well. So we could probably move those cusps a little bit more distal. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a little bit to the distal portion of those cones. And then later I can carve the mesial portion to move those cones a little bit towards the distal. Okay, like this. And then maybe carve away a little bit from the mesial. Like so. And the same thing here. And then this cusp will end up going pretty much between this interproximal embrasure here, this occlusal embrasure. And we can move this a little bit more lingual so that it's not so close to the periphery of that tooth. So we move it here. I'm going to cut away a little bit from here. Melt it back together. That's a little bit too distal now. We don't want it exactly in the embrasure. Just pretty much close to it. Then we can correct it on the after we remove the model from the articulator. we know just about where we want to be with that cusp, and we want to be a little bit more towards the inside of the tooth, towards the central groove. Okay, and then we're going to make a little space here. So that we have room for the blue wax, for the contouring. Okay, so we have all the cusp tips on the cusp to fossa.